What happens when you try to ambush a legend? A young liberal journalist, let's call him Alex, thought he had the perfect plan to take down Clint Eastwood at a prestigious Hollywood gala. Instead, he learned the hardest lesson of his career, right in front of his girlfriend's increasingly admiring eyes. The grand ballroom buzzed with anticipation. Celebrities, producers, and media figures mingled under crystal chandeliers. But Alex wasn't there to network. He clutched his press badge, rehearsing his carefully crafted provocations. One last time, his girlfriend, an aspiring documentary filmmaker named Sarah, squeezed his arm reassuringly. They had prepared for weeks for this moment, this chance to expose what they saw as everything wrong with old Hollywood. That's when Eastwood entered the room. The crowd's energy shifted instantly. Even at his age, he commanded attention without demanding it. Alex felt his confidence waver for a split second as Eastwood's steely gaze swept across the room. Oh man, Alex thought, his heart pounding. Is this really happening? But it was too late to back down now. Let's do this, Sarah whispered, her camera ready. They had planned every detail, the questions, the timing, even their positions in the room. What they hadn't planned for was Eastwood's uncanny ability to read people like open books. Alex approached, microphone in hand, wearing what he thought was his most disarming smile. Sarah flanked him, already wearing a smug expression that would soon vanish. Neither of them realized they were walking straight into a master class in dignity, wisdom, and the dying art of true masculinity. What happened next would not only change their lives forever, but would teach everyone present a lesson about respect, redemption, and the power of choosing wisdom over vengeance. And it all began with one catastrophically misplaced attempt at mockery. "Mr. Eastwood," Alex called out, his voice carrying that particular tone of fake politeness that barely masked contempt. "Care to comment on how Hollywood's old guard seems increasingly out of touch with modern values?" The room tensed. Several phones emerged to record what many expected to be a controversial moment. Eastwood turned slowly, his expression unchanging. The young reporter continued, emboldened by the attention. "Some say your films represent everything wrong with toxic masculinity in American cinema. My girlfriend here is actually making a documentary about it." He gestured to Sarah, who stepped forward with her camera, an air of intellectual superiority radiating from her. The silence that followed wasn't what they expected. Eastwood simply studied them both, as if reading volumes in their nervous fidgeting and forced bravado. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had nothing to prove. "Interesting," Eastwood said, "that you'd mentioned being out of touch." He paused, his eyes showing not anger, but something that made Alex far more uncomfortable. Understanding. "Tell me, how's that campaign to save your local paper going?" Alex's smug expression faltered. How could Eastwood possibly know about his struggling newspaper? Sarah's camera lowered slightly, her certainty beginning to crack. That's not relevant to..." Alex stammered, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. But Eastwood continued, his voice remaining measured and calm. "And your documentary," he turned to Sarah, "about toxic masculinity in Hollywood. Did you include the part about your scholarship? The one from the Veterans Film Program I helped establish 30 years ago?" Sarah's camera lowered completely now, her face flushing. She hadn't included that detail in any of her social media attacks on Eastwood. "Oh no," she thought, her stomach twisting. "He knows." The crowd watched transfixed as the power dynamic shifted palpably. Alex, desperate to regain control, decided to launch into his prepared mockery. He opened his mouth, ready to deploy what he thought would be a devastating verbal jab. But in his nervousness, his tongue slipped on Eastwood's name, creating an embarrassing mispronunciation that would come back to haunt him in ways he never expected. The journalist's verbal slip echoed through the suddenly silent ballroom. Clint, he stammered, his face reddening as scattered snickers rippled through the crowd. No, he thought, mortified. Eastwood's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but the same look he'd given countless overconfident opponents in his films. "Go ahead," he said, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that made several audience members exchange knowing glances. "Make my day." The collective gasp was audible. Everyone knew what usually followed that line in his movies. But this was different. This wasn't a scripted showdown. It was a lesson in real-world dignity. Based on how your girlfriend's been looking at me for the past 5 minutes, Eastwood continued, his timing impeccable, I'd say if I were what you just called me, you wouldn't have found me. The crowd erupted in concealed laughter. But Eastwood wasn't going for cheap shots. His next words carried a weight that silenced the room. You know what's interesting about your newspaper, he continued. It's the same one that ran a story about a young Marine in Vietnam. November 1970. The Marine had saved his entire unit. Your father, wasn't it? Alex's face drained of color. Sarah turned to him, shocked. He'd never mentioned his father's military service in any of their discussions about toxic masculinity and outdated values. How did he? Alex barely managed to whisper. I make it my business to understand people, Eastwood replied, his voice softening slightly, especially those who think they want to be my enemies. Your father's story, it moved me. Read it when it first came out. That paper used to stand for something back then. Still could. Sarah's camera had long since stopped recording. She was now watching Eastwood with undisguised admiration, her preconceptions about toxic masculinity crumbling in real time as she witnessed true strength, not in displays of power, but in the choice to show mercy when holding all the cards. Alex's prepared attacks lay forgotten as he struggled with emotions he hadn't expected to face tonight. But Eastwood wasn't finished. He had one more revelation that would transform this attempted takedown into something none of them could have anticipated. That story about your father, Eastwood continued, his voice carrying decades of wisdom, wasn't just any story. It was the last great piece of journalism your paper published before corporate takeover threats started watering down its content. Now you're here trying to make a name for yourself by tearing down others, when what you really want is to save what your father helped build. Alex stood frozen, Sarah's hand dropping from his arm as she processed this revelation. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the intensity of the moment, but Eastwood spoke as if they were the only 3 people in the room. You did your homework on me, Eastwood acknowledged, but focused on finding weak spots instead of understanding. That's not journalism. That's just revenge against a world you think has left you behind. Sarah stepped forward, her documentary's premise forgotten. But your films, the masculinity they portray, is about protection, not power, Eastwood finished for her. About standing up for what's right, even when it's not popular. Kind of like what a good local newspaper does. His gaze returned to Alex, or used to do. The young reporter's facade cracked completely. The paper's 1 week away from being bought out, he confessed, his voice breaking. Everything my father worked for. I thought if I could just get one viral moment, one big story, by becoming everything your father's paper stood against. Eastwood's words cut deep, but his tone remained compassionate. You know, I've been thinking about investing in local journalism. The room collectively held its breath. Sarah's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. This man they'd come to ambush was offering salvation instead of destruction. In fact, Eastwood continued, pulling a card from his pocket, I've had my eye on a particular paper with a strong history of veteran stories. Been waiting to talk to someone who cares enough about it to risk everything, even their dignity, to save it. Though, he added with a hint of his trademark smile, I might suggest less ambush journalism and more actual reporting. Alex's hands trembled as he took the card. Sarah was now looking at both men with tears in her eyes, her camera hanging forgotten at her side. But this moment of redemption came with a challenge that would test everything they thought they knew about themselves. But before we discuss the paper's future, Eastwood said, his voice carrying both authority and understanding, I want to know what you really think you're fighting against. He gestured to Sarah's camera. Both of you. No cameras, no act, no prepared speeches. Just truth. The ballroom had become a crucible of transformation. Other guests maintained a respectful distance, witnessing what had evolved from an attempted takedown into a profound moment of mentorship. Sarah spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. We thought we were fighting against everything you represent, but watching you just now... She looked at Alex, then back at Eastwood. You could have destroyed us both. You had every right to. Instead, you showed the kind of strength my documentary was too blind to recognize. Alex struggled with his own revelation. The paper? It wasn't just about my father. It was about a time when journalism meant something different, when we built bridges instead of burning them. He looked down at the card in his hand. I became everything I claimed to be fighting against. Eastwood nodded, satisfied with their honesty. You know what makes a real man a man? He asked, though the question was clearly meant for both of them. It's not about being tough. It's about being tough enough to show mercy, about having the power to destroy someone, but choosing to help them instead. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. This is the business proposal for saving your paper. Been carrying it around for weeks, waiting to see if its next generation of leadership would show up. The question is, he fixed them both with that legendary steely gaze, are you ready to carry on your father's legacy the right way? Sarah's camera, still recording, captured the moment Alex transformed from an angry young journalist into his father's son. But Eastwood had one final lesson to deliver, one that would challenge not just them, but everyone present to reconsider what true strength really means. Real strength, Eastwood said, addressing not just the couple but the entire room, isn't about winning arguments, going viral. It's about standing for something bigger than yourself. His words carried the weight of decades of wisdom. Your father understood that, he told Alex. Maybe it's time you both did too. Sarah's camera had become a witness to a very different story than the one she'd planned to tell. Instead of exposing toxic masculinity, she'd captured its antidote, strength tempered by wisdom, power guided by compassion. The paper needs young voices, Eastwood continued, but it needs voices that build rather than destroy. Think you're up for that challenge? Alex looked at the folder in his hands, then at Sarah, seeing in her eyes the same realization he'd come to. They'd come looking for a villain and found a mentor instead. The story they'd wanted to tell had become the story that would change them. Mr. Eastwood, Alex began, his voice steady for the first time that evening. I think my father would have liked to see that story written. Then write it, Eastwood replied with a knowing smile, and make it count. As the couple left the gala that night, they carried with them not just a business proposal, but a lesson about justice, mercy, and true strength. The paper would survive, but more importantly, its soul would be restored. Sometimes the greatest stories aren't about taking someone down, but about lifting everyone up. And that's how an attempted ambush turned into a masterclass in respect, humility, and the power of second chances. Clint Eastwood showed us all that true strength isn't about proving a point or tearing others down. It's about standing for something bigger than yourself and choosing to build rather than destroy. So what do you think? Have you ever had a moment where you realized you were fighting the wrong battle or misjudged someone? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and its powerful lesson, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content. And if you have a story to share or a lesson you've learned, we'd love to hear it in the comments. Remember, the world needs more stories that lift people up. Let's write them together. See you next time.